She came to Montana with a single suitcase, a stranger's photograph, and a letter that promised her a new life. What she found instead was a household that hated her, a man who didn't trust her, and an enemy who wanted her dead. Clara Whitmore didn't come west to be loved. She came to survive, but surviving Blackthorn Ranch would cost her more than she ever imagined. This is a story about a woman who had nothing, walked into a world that wanted nothing to do with her, and fought until she became the one thing nobody could take away. Drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this story travels. And if you're new here, subscribe and stay close. You won't want to miss what comes next. The stagecoach smelled like dust and old leather, and the particular sourness of 6 people who'd been trapped together for 4 days without a proper bath. Clara Whitmore sat wedged between a large man in a wool coat and a woman holding a birdcage on her lap, and she had learned, somewhere around the second day, to simply stop breathing through her nose. Outside the small window, Montana stretched in every direction, wider and emptier than anything she had ever seen growing up in Ohio. Back home, there had always been something to look at. A neighbor's fence, a mill, the edge of someone's cornfield. Here there was just land, miles of it. Brown grass rolling out toward mountains so large they looked painted against the sky, like a backdrop someone had hung up and forgotten to take down. Clara pressed her forehead against the window glass and tried to feel something other than tired. She had the photograph in her coat pocket. She'd looked at it so many times the edges had gone soft. A man standing in front of a large house. No, a ranch house, she corrected herself. Square-shouldered, dark-haired, staring at the camera with the expression of someone doing an unpleasant errand. Nathaniel Crow, age 38. Widower, 2 daughters. 1,200 acres of Montana territory. She had read those details in his first letter so many times she could have recited them in her sleep. What the letters hadn't said, what she had understood only gradually, reading between the careful sentences, was that Nathaniel Crow was not looking for a wife. Not really. He was looking for someone to fill a gap, a practical solution to a practical problem. His daughters needed a woman in the house. His household needed managing. He had more land than he could oversee and more money than he could spend, and the one thing he didn't have anymore was anyone to carry the weight of the daily life that money couldn't actually run. Clara understood that perfectly well. She wasn't looking for romance either. She was looking for a way not to drown. Her father had died 11 months ago. Pneumonia, fast and unforgiving, and by the time the doctor left, half the neighbors already knew they'd be bidding on the furniture. The house had been mortgaged twice over, something Clara hadn't known, because her father had been the kind of man who protected his daughter from difficulty by simply not mentioning it. The school where he'd taught closed the following spring. There was nothing left. A cousin in Cincinnati had offered her a spare room, but Clara had seen the look on the cousin's face when she said it, the calculation behind the generosity, and she'd known that spare room would cost her something she didn't have left to give. So when a woman at the Methodist Social told her about a registry, a service that matched Western ranchers with unmarried women from the East, Clara had listened. She told herself she was just curious. She wrote to 3 names on the list. 2 never wrote back. Nathaniel Crow wrote back within 2 weeks, a single page, formal and direct, outlining what he needed and what he could offer in return. Room, board, a fair allowance, his name. No pretenses about love or partnership. Just an arrangement between 2 adults who both needed something the other could provide. Claire wrote back the same day. She told him she was 26, a teacher's daughter, had run her father's household since she was 14, could cook and sew and manage accounts and read to children. She did not tell him about the grief that had been sitting in her chest since October, heavy and shapeless, like something she kept swallowing and couldn't get rid of. She figured that wasn't his business. He wrote again. She wrote again. 4 exchanges over 6 weeks, and at the end of it, there was an agreement and a train ticket west. The woman with the birdcage got off at Billings. The man in the wool coat got off somewhere after that. By the time the stagecoach reached Harlan Creek, it was just Clara and a sleeping old man across from her, and the particular sound of the wheels hitting ruts in the unpaved road. She felt the town before she saw it. A slowing of the horses, a shift in the driver's posture up on top. Then they rounded a bend, and Harlan Creek appeared, and Clara looked at it through the dusty window and felt her stomach drop. It was smaller than she'd expected. One main street, maybe 3 blocks long. A general store, a livery, a barber, a church, a saloon with its paint peeling in long strips. A post office the size of a closet. The whole thing looked like it had been dropped in the middle of the prairie by accident and was waiting for someone to notice and move it somewhere else. She collected herself. She was good at collecting herself. She'd had a lot of practice. The stagecoach stopped in front of what appeared to be a hotel, though the sign was missing half its letters, and the driver called out the stop. Clara smoothed her coat, picked up her suitcase, and stepped down onto the street. The cold hit her like a hand to the face. Ohio winters had been cold, but this was different. A dry, hard cold that came from the mountains and didn't apologize. She blinked against it and looked around. A man was standing by the post office watching her. He was taller than she'd expected from the photograph. Leaner. The photograph had been taken in summer light, and she'd imagined someone easier looking than the man standing 20 feet away in a dark coat, hat pulled low, arms crossed at his chest. He wasn't frowning exactly. He was doing something more careful than frowning. Watching her the way you watch something you weren't sure about yet. She walked toward him because there was nothing else to do. "Mr. Crow," she said, when she was close enough that she didn't have to shout. "Miss Whitmore?" He looked at her suitcase, then at her face. "That everything you brought?" "Yes." He nodded once, like she'd confirmed something he'd already suspected. "Wagons around the side. We'll go before it gets dark." No welcome. No handshake. No comment about the journey. Clara followed him around the side of the building to a wagon where a ranch hand was waiting with the horses, and she climbed up onto the bench before anyone could offer to help her. She was not starting this by needing to be helped onto a wagon. They rode out of Harlan Creek in the last hour of afternoon light, heading north along a road that was more suggestion than fact, and Nathaniel didn't say a word for the first 10 minutes. The ranch hand, a young man with red hair who'd introduced himself as Tom, glanced at Clara once with something that might have been sympathy, then went back to looking at the horses. "The house is larger than what you're probably used to," Nathaniel said finally. "I'll manage." "The girls are 7 and 10. Lydia's the older one. Rose is—" He stopped, started again. "Rose has had a hard year." Clara looked at him. "Because of their mother." He kept his eyes on the road. "Among other things." She didn't push. She had learned enough from his letters to know that Nathaniel Crow did not offer information he hadn't planned to give, and that pushing would get her nothing except a longer silence. She turned back to the land instead, watching the mountains pull purple in the fading light. It was beautiful, she thought, in the way that difficult things sometimes were, not comfortable, not welcoming, but stunning in its indifference. The land did not care that she was here. The land would look exactly the same whether she stayed or left. There was something almost restful in that. They reached Blackthorn Ranch as the last light was leaving the sky. She had expected the name to be dramatic overstatement, the kind of frontier naming that turned a modest property into something grand. She had been wrong. The ranch was large by any measure she'd encountered. A main house with 2 full stories, a wide front porch, and windows that caught the last of the light and threw it back. A barn that could have held 50 horses comfortably. Bunkhouses along the western edge. Fencing that ran farther than she could see in the dark. The yard between the house and the barn was packed dirt, well worn, and a few ranch hands crossed it as the wagon pulled in, pausing to look at her without pretending not to. She looked back at them. She had learned early that the quickest way to appear weak was to pretend you didn't notice being stared at. Nathaniel climbed down and came around to offer his hand for the step, and she took it because refusing it would have been theatrical. His grip was dry and brief, and he let go immediately. A woman appeared on the porch, late 40s, heavy set, with gray-streaked hair pinned severely back. She looked at Clara the way you looked at a stain you weren't sure you could get out of fabric. "Mrs. Holt," Nathaniel said. "This is Miss Whitmore." "Ma'am," Clara said. Mrs. Holt's mouth pressed flat. "Supper's been held. You'll want to eat before it gets cold." It wasn't exactly a greeting, but Clara stepped up onto the porch and followed the woman inside. And she looked around at the hallway, wide, dark-paneled, hung with the heads of animals she didn't know the names of. And she thought, all right then, this is what it is. The inside of the house was the kind of clean that comes from discipline rather than comfort. Everything was in its place. Nothing looked touched. There was a parlor to the left with chairs arranged at precise angles and a fireplace that appeared to never be lit, and a dining room to the right where two small figures sat at the ends of a long table, waiting. Clara walked to the doorway and stopped. The older girl, Lydia, 10 years old, sat with her spine very straight and her dark hair pinned back in a way that made her look like she was trying to appear older than she was. She looked at Clara with an expression that was carefully neutral, which Clara recognized as the most deliberate kind of hostility. She was her father's daughter in that way, at least. The younger one, Rose, was 7, and she had clearly been crying recently. Her eyes were still swollen at the edges. She was staring at the tablecloth, and she did not look up when Clara came in. Nathaniel moved past Clara into the room and took his seat at the head of the table. "Lydia, Rose," he said, "this is Miss Whitmore. She'll be staying with us." Lydia said, "Good evening, Miss Whitmore," in a voice she had practiced. Rose didn't say anything. Clara pulled out the chair across from Lydia and sat down. Mrs. Holt appeared with plates, setting them down with the particular energy of someone making a point. Clara noticed that her own portion was the smallest. She also noticed that Mrs. Holt didn't make eye contact with her once during the whole meal. She ate. The food was good, better than she'd expected, and she was hungry enough that she didn't care much about the silence or the watching. Rose ate nothing. Lydia ate carefully, keeping her eyes on her plate. Nathaniel ate steadily, without apparent interest in the food, and he looked at Clara twice during the meal with that same assessing look he'd given her outside the post office. She looked back at him both times without looking away first. After supper, Mrs. Holt showed her to a room on the second floor. It was clean and plainly furnished: a bed, a washstand, a single chair, one window that looked out over the dark yard, a lantern on the table. "Breakfast is at 6, Mrs. Holt said. "Mr. Crow expects punctuality." "I'll be down at 5:30, Clara said. "I'd like to help with the preparation." Something moved across Mrs. Holt's face. Surprise, maybe, or suspicion. "That won't be necessary." "I know it's not necessary," Clara said. "I'd like to, anyway." Mrs. Holt left without responding to that. Clara sat on the edge of the bed and listened to the sounds of the house settling around her. Footsteps overhead, the low voice of the ranch hand somewhere outside, the wind coming hard off the open land. She was very far from Ohio. She was very far from everything she had known. She opened her suitcase and took out the small folded letter that she'd read so many times the paper had gone thin at the creases. Her father's last letter, written before he was too sick to hold a pen. She didn't read it. She just held it for a moment, the way you held something when you needed to remember what you were doing this for. Then she put it away and lay down on top of the blanket with her clothes still on, because it was cold and because she was too tired to do otherwise. And she stared at the dark ceiling of Blackthorn Ranch and thought about what she'd gotten herself into. In the morning, she was in the kitchen by 5:20. Mrs. Holt arrived at 5:40 and stopped in the doorway when she saw that the water was already on and the bread was already cut. "I told you. I know what you told me," Clara said. She kept her back to the door and her voice level. "But I'm going to be in this house a long time, Mrs. Holt. I'd rather learn how things are done than get in the way of them." A pause. Then the sound of Mrs. Holt coming into the kitchen and pulling down the skillet she needed from the hook above the stove. It wasn't agreement, but it wasn't a fight either. Outside, as the light came up gray over the flat land, Clara could see the ranch beginning to stir, men crossing the yard to the barn, horses being let out, the sounds of work starting up like a machine turning over. A different kind of world from anything she'd come from. A world that had its own rules and its own rhythms, and had absolutely no interest in adjusting itself to accommodate her. She listened to it and thought, fine, then I'll adjust to it. Nathaniel came down at 6 on the mark. He stopped when he saw Clara at the stove, the same brief startled pause that Mrs. Holt had made, then recovered and went to his seat without comment. The girls came down 2 minutes later. Lydia first, neatly dressed. Rose still in yesterday's braids, blinking sleep out of her eyes. Clara brought the plates herself. She set Rose's down gently because the child looked like she might flinch at sudden movement, and she tried to make it casual, matter of fact, not the kind of gentle, that could be mistaken for pity. "Do you like eggs?" she asked Rose. Rose looked at her plate, looked at Clara, looked away again. "Sometimes," she said, so quietly it was almost nothing. "I make them better than this usually," Clara said. "I was still finding my way around the stove this morning." Lydia looked up sharply, as if checking whether this was a performance. Clara met her gaze without drama. "The eggs are fine," Nathaniel said, and went back to eating. That was how the first morning went. Not well, and not badly, just carefully, like two groups of people deciding whether the ground between them was safe to cross. Over the days that followed, Clara learned the landscape of the household in the same methodical way she would have learned a new map. Mrs. Holt ran the kitchen and the house staff, two younger women who did the cleaning and laundry, with an authority that predated Clara's arrival by years, and Clara did not try to displace her. She worked beside her instead, asking questions when she needed to and staying quiet when Mrs. Holt needed her to. It was uncomfortable at first, the way learning anything is uncomfortable, and Mrs. Holt made no effort to soften the edges. But Clara had grown up in her father's household watching him manage things. The careful art of making yourself useful without making someone feel replaced. The ranch hands were a different problem. There were 12 of them, not counting Tom, and they ranged in age from a boy of about 16 to a weathered man named Gus, who Clara guessed was somewhere past 60 and had been with Nathaniel for a decade at least. They were polite in the way that people are polite when they're watching to see if you're going to make their lives harder. The younger ones were almost aggressively cheerful in a way that made Clara suspect they'd been warned by someone, Nathaniel probably, to treat her decently. But she heard things. Not said to her face, never that. But she was good at knowing when she'd just missed a comment, at reading the way a conversation changed when she walked into a room. Mail order woman. Doesn't know what she's in for. Give her a month before she's back on the stage east. Clara didn't confront any of it. Confronting it would have proved exactly what they thought. That she was soft, that she was rattled, that frontier life was more than she could handle. Instead, she just kept showing up. Every morning at 5:20, every evening at the table, every afternoon in whatever corner of the work she could find her way into. The second week, she asked Gus if she could come out to the pasture with him when he checked the south fence. He looked at her like she'd suggested something mildly absurd, but he said yes, and she walked the fence line with him for 3 hours without complaining about the cold or the pace, or the fact that her good shoes were the wrong choice for that kind of ground. "You've got a hole here," she said, pointing to a section where 2 posts had pulled apart. Gus squinted at it. "I can see that. I wasn't telling you. I was asking, is that something that gets fixed right away, or does it get added to a list?" He looked at her sideways. "Depends on what's in that pasture." "Right." She made a note of it. She'd started keeping a small notebook in her coat pocket. Just practical things, what needed doing, what she'd noticed, questions she wanted to ask. Not because anyone asked her to, because it was the kind of woman she was. Gus didn't say much more on the walk back. But the next morning he told Tom, loudly enough that Clara could hear through the kitchen window, that the East woman wasn't completely useless. She counted that as progress. With the girls, it was slower. Lydia was the kind of child who had learned to protect herself by maintaining careful distance, and she was very good at it for a 10-year-old. She was polite to Clara every single day, and she was every single day absolutely unreachable behind that politeness. She answered questions with complete sentences. She did her chores without being asked. She appeared at every meal and sat through it and said the right things, and Clara could not get a single real moment out of her. Rose was different. Rose was not distant. She was present, vividly and uncomfortably present. But that presence was mostly grief and confusion, and she didn't know what to do with Clara, and so she cried. Not constantly, not dramatically, but in the way that small children cry when they're overwhelmed and can't explain why. Suddenly, in the middle of things, and then for a long time. Clara's first instinct, when it happened the third day, was to comfort the child. She crossed the room and put her hand on Rose's shoulder, and Rose twisted away from her so hard she nearly fell out of her chair. "I don't want you," Rose said. Not cruelly, just as a fact. The way a 7-year-old states a fact. Clara pulled her hand back. "That's all right," she said, and she meant it. and she went back to what she was doing, and she let Rose cry. She talked to Nathaniel about it that evening when the girls were in bed. He was in his office, a room she hadn't been inside yet, lined with ledgers and land maps, everything precisely ordered, and she knocked on the open door and waited. He looked up. "Come in." She came in and sat down across from the desk because standing made it feel like she was reporting to him, and she wanted this to be a conversation. "Rose pulled away when I touched her today. I just want to know how to handle it. Whether you'd rather I kept my distance with her for a while, or—" "She's not used to strangers," Nathaniel said. "I understand that. Her mother used to—" He stopped, set down his pen, picked it up again. "She was the kind of woman who touched everyone. Rose expected that. She misses it." Clara looked at him. He was staring at his ledger but not reading it. "When did you lose her?" 2 years ago. He said it in a tone that made it clear the number was all he was going to give her. "I'm not trying to replace her," Clara said. "I'm not. But I'd rather you tell me what I shouldn't do than have me guess and get it wrong." Something moved across his face, something brief and difficult. "You're not doing anything wrong," he said. "Just give her time." Clara nodded. She stood to go, and then Nathaniel said, without looking up from the ledger, "You were in the kitchen at 5:30 this morning." It wasn't a question. "Yes." "Mrs. Holt said you cut the bread and put the water on." "I did." He was quiet for a moment. "You didn't have to do that." "I know," Clara said. "Good night, Mr. Crow." She went back to her room. She sat on the edge of her bed and looked at her hands, reddened from the cold and the work, no longer quite the hands she'd had in Ohio, and she thought about what he hadn't said, which was, "Thank you," or "I'm glad you're here," or anything that would have made this easier. But she also thought about the fact that he'd noticed, that he'd mentioned it, that he'd bothered. She wasn't expecting much from Blackthorn Ranch. She wasn't expecting warmth or welcome or any of the things you might hope for coming into a new place. She'd known what she was walking into, or thought she had. What she hadn't expected was how much it would feel like something worth staying for. Not because of Nathaniel, not yet, not in any way she could name, but because of the land outside the window that was hard and real and enormous. Because of Lydia's careful politeness that she understood, even if she couldn't reach it. Because of Rose crying in the kitchen, and then, later, very quietly, eating the eggs Clara had cooked without saying a word about them. Because of the notebook in her coat pocket, filling up with things that needed doing, and the particular feeling of being a person who noticed what needed doing and did it. She had come west to survive. She had come to put enough distance between herself and the life that had collapsed in Ohio that she could breathe without it hurting quite so much. She had not come to belong anywhere. But standing in the cold kitchen at 5:20 in the morning with the land going gray outside the window, Clara Whitmore found herself thinking, for the first time in nearly a year, that belonging somewhere was maybe not as impossible as she'd told herself it was. She wasn't going to say it out loud. She wasn't going to hope for it openly, because hope had a way of making you careless, and she could not afford careless. Not here. But she let herself think it in the dark, privately, the way you let yourself think things you haven't decided to believe in yet. And she got up in the morning and she went back downstairs. The notebook filled faster than Clara had expected. By the end of her second week at Blackthorn Ranch, she had 3 pages of small, tight handwriting, a broken latch on the cellar door, a section of roof over the east bunkhouse that leaked when it rained, 2 horses in the far pasture that Gus said were showing early signs of something he couldn't name but didn't like the look of. She'd written down the girls' schedules, what they ate and didn't eat, when Rose typically fell apart in the afternoons, and what seemed to set it off. She'd written down the names of all 12 ranch hands and 1 or 2 things about each one that would help her remember them. Not just Tom with his red hair, but Ellis, who was missing the tip of his left index finger and never talked about it, and a quiet man named Darnell who read in the evenings by the bunkhouse door when the light allowed it. She had not written down anything about Nathaniel Crow. There were things she noticed. She always noticed things. But she wasn't ready to put any of them on paper yet. They felt too provisional, too easy to misread. What she knew for certain was that he was a man who said less than he thought, worked longer hours than anyone on his payroll, and had a particular way of going very still when something bothered him, like a person holding a door closed against wind. She had seen it twice in 2 weeks, once when a letter arrived from somewhere she didn't recognize, and once when Rose had one of her bad afternoons and the crying went on longer than usual. Both times he'd gone still in exactly the same way, and then resumed what he was doing with the careful deliberateness of someone who had decided not to feel something. She understood that. She was doing the same thing herself, more or less. The third week brought the first real test. It started with the laundry. Clara had been helping with the household work in whatever ways Mrs. Holt would allow, which was still limited but had expanded slightly. She was trusted now with the bread and the breakfast preparation, and occasionally with the accounts book when Mrs. Holt's eyes were giving her trouble. But the laundry was one of the things Mrs. Holt had not offered, and Clara had not pushed on, because there were only so many fronts she could manage at once, and she'd been prioritizing the girls. That morning, one of the young housemaids, a girl named Bess, 17 and skittish, managed to drop an entire basket of clean linens into the mud outside the back door. Bess stood there looking at the ruined pile with the expression of someone calculating how bad the consequences were going to be, and Clara came around the corner of the house and stopped. "Is Mrs. Holt inside?" Clara asked. Bess looked up. Her eyes were already filling. "She went to the cellar. The girl stopped. "She's going to be so angry." Clara looked at the linens, looked at the mud, looked at the sky, which was gray but not threatening rain for another few hours at least. "Go get the washboard," she said, "and the large basin. Don't say anything to Mrs. Holt yet." Bess blinked. "Ma'am?" "Go, quickly." They spent the next 2 hours rewashing every linen in the yard. It was cold enough that Clara's hands went red and stiff within the first 20 minutes, and she had to stop twice to warm them against her coat before she could keep working. Bess worked hard beside her, quiet at first, then gradually less tense, and by the time they were hanging the last of it on the line, some of the fear had gone out of the girl's posture. Mrs. Holt came out to the yard at some point and stood there watching them. Clara glanced at her once and kept working. She waited for a comment, something about interference, something about overstepping. But Mrs. Holt said nothing. She stood there for a minute and then went back inside. At lunch, she poured Clara's tea first. It wasn't forgiveness or welcome or anything that large, but it was a shift, and Clara knew enough to recognize a shift when it happened and not to make a fuss of it. The harder work was with the girls. Lydia's distance was consistent and maddening. She was so carefully polite that getting through it felt like trying to find a door in a wall that had been plastered over smooth. Clara tried several different approaches in those early weeks. Sitting with her in the evenings when she did her schoolwork, asking about her interests, telling her small, ordinary things about Ohio without making a production of it. Lydia responded to everything with the same courteous neutrality, and Clara started to wonder whether the child had simply decided, somewhere in the back of her 10-year-old mind, that caring about someone new was a thing she was not going to do again. Clara didn't push. She just stayed in the room. She figured that was all she could do. Stay in the room and not go anywhere, and let Lydia decide when that meant something. Rose was harder, in a different way. The 7-year-old's grief was not contained the way Lydia's was. It moved through her without warning, and when it came, it was total. She would be fine at breakfast and then in tears by mid-morning without any apparent cause. Or she would start crying in the middle of a meal and not be able to stop for half an hour. The ranch hands had learned to look away when it happened. Mrs. Holt would murmur something short and awkward. Nathaniel would get very still. Clara sat with her. Not to fix it. She'd learned quickly that trying to fix it only made Rose twist away, just to sit, to be a body in the room. She brought her a cup of warm water with a little honey in it the second time it happened, because her own mother had done that for her once when she was very small and sick, and it was the only thing she could think of. Rose didn't drink it that day, but she stopped crying a little sooner than usual. The third time, she drank half of it. Clara didn't say anything about it. She didn't mention it at dinner, and she didn't tell Nathaniel, and she didn't treat it as a milestone. She just noted it in the back of her mind and moved on to the next day. Nathaniel noticed, though. He always seemed to notice things from a distance, even when he appeared to be looking somewhere else entirely. She hasn't had an afternoon like that in a few days, he said one evening. He was coming in from the barn, still in his work coat, and Clara was on the porch with her notebook, writing down something she'd need to tell Mrs. Holt in the morning. The light was going flat and orange across the yard. She's been better, Clara agreed. He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. What did you do? Nothing particular. She looked at him. I just stayed. He stood there a moment with that unreadable expression. She didn't throw anything? She threw a boot at me last Tuesday, Clara said. Something passed through his expression that might, in a man who allowed himself such things, have been the beginning of a smile. She threw a hairbrush at Mrs. Holt last month. I consider it an improvement over a hairbrush, Clara said. He went inside and Clara went back to her notebook, and she allowed herself, very privately, to feel slightly better than she had that morning. But the ranch hands were not improving at the same rate. The politeness was still there, surface level, obligatory, but underneath it the opinions hadn't changed. She heard Ellis telling someone in the barn one afternoon that Mr. Crow had made a mistake with this one, that a woman from the east couldn't last a Montana winter. She heard another man, one of the younger ones she didn't know well yet, saying something about mail-order women not knowing what they'd signed up for and always leaving come spring. Clara stood outside the barn for a moment with her hand on the door, deciding. Then she went inside and asked Gus where the spare saddle soap was kept. Gus told her, looking at her like he wasn't sure why she wanted it. I'm going to condition the tack in the small barn this afternoon, she said. If anyone has time to help, I'd welcome it, but I'll manage either way. She spent 3 hours that afternoon working through the tack in the small barn by herself. It was tedious, unpleasant work. The leather was stiff from the cold, and there was a lot of it. And her hands were in bad shape by the time she finished. But she finished all of it, and she hung everything back where it belonged, and she did not ask for help, and she did not complain. That evening at supper, Gus mentioned to Nathaniel, with the air of a man stating a neutral fact, that Miss Whitmore had done the small barn tack that afternoon. Nathaniel looked at Clara. I noticed it needed doing, she said, and passed the bread. After that, the younger men were a little less loud in their doubts. Not won over. She wasn't foolish enough to think that, but quieter about it, which was enough for now. What Clara had not expected coming into the third week was how physically hard the life was. She had known it would be hard. She had told herself so, practically and repeatedly, on the long journey west. But knowing a thing and feeling it in your body are different categories of knowledge, and her body had been making that point insistently for days. Her hands were damaged from the cold and the work. Her feet hurt from the wrong shoes. She'd ordered better ones through the general store in Harlan Creek, but they hadn't arrived yet. She was waking at 5:20 and often not sleeping until past 10 at night, and the work between those hours was relentless in a way that Ohio life, even at its most demanding, had never been. She didn't say any of this. She wouldn't have, even if she'd had someone to say it to. But there were moments, usually late, when the house was quiet, and she was sitting on her bed with her coat still on because she was too tired to bother with the buttons, when she let herself feel it. The exhaustion and the loneliness and the peculiar grief of not belonging anywhere, which was different from the grief of losing something. Losing something, you could point to it. This was more like trying to describe the shape of a room you were still finding your way around in the dark. She was not going to leave. She had decided that somewhere around day 4, when she'd woken up tired and cold and been tempted to do the math on how much of the train fare she could recover. She'd done the math, and then she'd put her feet on the floor and gone downstairs, and that had been the decision. She wasn't going to keep making it every morning. She was just going to get up. The shoe order arrived on a Thursday, which happened to be the same Thursday that Nathaniel came home from Harlan Creek, with his jaw set and his eyes in a particular place that meant something had gone wrong in town. Clara was in the front room with Lydia when he came in. They were going through Lydia's reading exercises, which was one of the first things the girl had let Clara help with, not because she'd warmed to her, but because Lydia hated that her reading was behind the level she thought it should be, and pragmatism had won out over coolness. Nathaniel moved through the hallway without looking in at them and went directly to his office. The door didn't close hard, but it closed. Lydia glanced at the hallway. He gets like that sometimes, she said, with the matter-of-factness of a child who has learned to read a parent's moods the way other children learn to read weather. "I see that," Clara said. "Do you want to keep going with this page?" "You don't need to stay in the room with me." Lydia said it without sharpness. "I know you probably want to see what's wrong with him." Clara looked at her. "I wasn't going anywhere." Lydia looked back at the page. She was quiet for a moment. "He gets like that when someone in town says something that bothers him." Another pause. "He won't tell you what it is. He doesn't tell anyone." "That's his choice to make," Clara said. Lydia looked up at her with something new in her expression. Not warmth exactly, but a kind of recalibration, like she'd expected one answer and gotten a different one. She went back to the page and read the next paragraph out loud, and she only stumbled twice, and she didn't look up to see if Clara had noticed the stumbling. Clara noticed. She didn't say anything. Later, when the girls were in bed, she knocked on Nathaniel's office door. "It's open." She went in. He was at his desk with a glass of something, whiskey from the look of it, and a letter that he'd apparently read several times because it was creased in new places since she'd seen a letter on his desk that morning. "Is it something that affects the household?" she asked. He looked at her. "What?" "Whatever happened in town today. I'm not asking you to explain it to me. I'm asking if it's something I should know about so I can manage things better here." He stared at her for a second. "Why would you assume it affects the household?" "Because you came home from town looking like you'd been handed bad news. And the only things I know of that would make you look like that are problems with the land, or problems with the girls, or problems with someone else's designs on either of those things." She kept her voice practical. "I'm not prying into your business. I'm asking whether it's my business too." Nathaniel set his glass down. He looked at the letter. He looked at Clara. "Victor Halston," he said, "has been telling people in town that he made me a fair offer for the South Pasture, and I turned him down out of stubbornness." "Did he make a fair offer?" "He offered me 40 cents on the dollar of what that land is worth." "So no." "No." He picked his glass back up. "But Halston's well-liked in Harlan Creek. He's got money in half the businesses on that street. When he tells a story, people tend to believe it." Clara considered this. "What does he want with the South Pasture?" "The river that runs through it." Nathaniel said it simply. "Controls the water access for 3 other properties. He's been wanting it for 2 years. He's not the kind of man who stops wanting something." She nodded slowly. "All right." She stood up. "Is there anything you need me to do?" He looked at her like she'd said something unexpected. "No." "All right," she said again. "Good night, Mr. Crow." She was almost to the door when he said, "Clara." She stopped. It was the first time he'd used her given name. "Yes?" He was looking at the letter again. "I'm not—" He stopped. Seemed to dislike whatever he'd been about to say, turned it a different direction. "Thank you for what you've been doing with the girls." It was not an easy thing for him to say. She could hear that. The particular flatness of someone saying something they mean, but aren't used to saying. "They're good girls," she said, and went upstairs. November deepened into something harder, the wind coming off the mountains with a bite that was different from anything the Ohio winters had prepared her for. The days were short now, light from about 8 in the morning until 4:30 in the afternoon, and Clara had to reorder her thinking about what could get done and when. She learned to work faster in the mornings and to save the tasks that didn't need daylight for the evenings. She also learned, by accident, that Lydia couldn't see well. It happened on a Tuesday when Clara set a book on the far end of the table and asked Lydia to read the title. Lydia squinted at it with the focused intensity of someone straining to resolve something blurry, and then gave up and said she didn't recognize that one. Clara picked the book up and held it closer, and Lydia read the title immediately. Clara set it back where it had been. "Come here," she said. Lydia came, wary. Clara held the book at various distances, close, medium, far. The pattern was clear. Close was fine, far was not. "Does your father know your vision is poor?" Clara asked. Lydia's chin went up. "My eyes are fine." "Your eyes are not fine. You can't read anything more than about 8 feet away." "I manage." "You do manage," Clara agreed. "You're very good at managing. That's not the point." She set the book down and looked at the girl directly. "How long have you been squinting like that?" Lydia was quiet for a moment, and something passed through her face that was younger than the expression she usually wore. "Since last winter, maybe. I didn't want to say anything because there's—" She stopped. "There's a lot going on. Papa has enough to deal with." Clara felt something shift in her chest. She recognized that calculation. The child deciding what the adults could afford to hear. She had done it herself at about that age, when her mother was sick. "Your eyes have nothing to do with what your father can or can't deal with," Clara said. "He'd want to know." "You're going to tell him." It wasn't accusing, just resigned. "Yes," Clara said, "but I'll tell him tonight after supper, so you don't have to be in the room for it if you'd rather not." Lydia looked at her. That recalibration again. Whatever she'd expected, it wasn't this. "You can just tell me and I'll deal with it." "I know you can. I'm still going to tell him." Clara started to turn back to the lesson, then stopped. "You don't have to do everything alone in this house, Lydia. That's not a requirement." Lydia said nothing, but she didn't look away immediately either, which was something new. That evening, Clara told Nathaniel about his daughter's eyes. He went very still in the way she'd come to recognize, and then he said that he'd arranged for the doctor from Harlan Creek to come out that week. He said it quietly, without drama, but she could see something working behind his face, the particular expression of a parent who has realized they missed something important about their own child. "She didn't tell me," he said. "She was protecting you." "She's 10 years old. She's not supposed to be protecting me." "No," Claire agreed. "She's not." He looked at her across the desk, and for a moment she had the feeling he wanted to say something that he wasn't sure how to say. But the moment passed, and he thanked her again in the same quiet, unpracticed way, and she went to bed. What happened at the end of that month was the thing that changed everything. Rose got sick. It came on suddenly, the way things come on with young children. One night she was tired and flushed at dinner, and by midnight she was burning with fever and coughing so hard that Clara could hear it from her room down the hall. She was up before Nathaniel was, going down the hall in the dark to Rose's room. And when she pushed open the door, she found the 7-year-old sitting up in bed with tears running down her face from the pain of the coughing and the confusion of being sick in the night, and probably from being afraid. Clara sat on the edge of the bed. She didn't ask permission. She put the back of her hand against Rose's forehead, which was hot and dry and bad, and she said, in the most ordinary voice she could manage, "You're all right. I've got you." Rose didn't pull away. She let Clara help her lie back against the pillow, and she held on to Clara's sleeve with 2 small fists while another round of coughing worked through her, and when it passed, she was so exhausted from it that she went almost limp. Nathaniel appeared in the doorway, half-dressed, holding a lamp. "How bad?" he asked. "Fever's high. The cough is coming in fits." Clara was already thinking through what she had, what she knew. "Get me the camphor if there is any. Kitchen cabinet, I think, left side, and boil some water and bring it up, and another blanket." He didn't question it. He went. She stayed with Rose all night. She stayed the next day too, sleeping in the chair beside the bed in intervals when Rose was quieter, getting up every time the child stirred. She made the compress for the fever and kept the steam going for the cough, and she fed her small amounts of broth every few hours when Rose could manage it. The doctor rode out from Harlan Creek on the second day and confirmed what Clara had suspected. A bad chest cold, not yet pneumonia, but the direction it was trying to go. He left medicine and instructions, and he told Nathaniel that whoever had been managing the child through the night had done the right things. Nathaniel was in the doorway of Rose's room when the doctor said that, and Clara did not look at him. On the third day, Rose's fever broke. She slept for 12 hours, deep and boneless, and when she woke up she was pale and thin-looking, and her voice was rough, but she was back in her eyes in a way she hadn't been for days. Clara brought her broth at noon. Rose took a few sips, looking at Clara over the rim of the cup with her particular 7-year-old directness. Then she said, "You stayed." "Yes." "The whole time?" "Most of it." Rose looked at the cup, looked back at Clara. "Why?" Clara considered a number of answers and settled on the true one. Because you were sick and you needed someone to stay. Rose was quiet. She took another sip of broth, then, in a small voice that was trying to be casual and wasn't quite making it, "Do you know how to braid hair?" Clara looked at her. "I do. Mama used to braid mine in the mornings." She touched one of her loose braids with a fingertip. "Mrs. Holt doesn't really know how to do it right." "When you're feeling better," Clara said, "I'll show you how I do it. You can tell me if you like it." Rose nodded and settled back against her pillow and closed her eyes. Clara sat beside her until she was asleep, which didn't take long. Then she sat a while longer in the quiet of the sick room, listening to the sound of the ranch outside. Horses, wind, the distant voices of men working. And she thought about Rose's small fists on her sleeve in the dark, and the fact that the child had not pulled away. She thought about how it had felt to stay. There was something she hadn't counted on when she'd come west, that the work she'd agreed to do, the practical, contractual work of managing a household and caring for 2 children, would stop feeling like work somewhere along the way and start feeling like something else, something that didn't have a clean name, something that pulled at her in the mornings and wouldn't let her be halfway about anything. She was not going to call it love. That felt reckless, and Clara Whitmore was not a reckless woman, but she was going to sit here for a little while longer in the quiet beside this sleeping child. And then she was going to go downstairs and make sure the household ran the way it needed to. And she was going to eat dinner with people who were still deciding what she was to them. And she was going to get up again tomorrow and do it all over again. Because that was what you did when something had started to matter. You stayed. Rose's recovery took the better part of 2 weeks. And in that time, something shifted in the household that nobody announced and nobody had to. It wasn't dramatic. There was no moment where Mrs. Holt sat down and said she'd changed her mind about Clara. No morning where Lydia came downstairs and decided to be open. It happened the way most real changes happen. Gradually, in small adjustments. The way a river changes course, not all at once, but grain by grain, until one day the water is going somewhere it wasn't going before. Mrs. Holt started leaving the account book out where Clara could find it without asking. Gus stopped looking mildly surprised when Clara appeared at the barn with a practical question. And Lydia, careful, armored, 10-year-old Lydia, started leaving her school books on the kitchen table in the evenings instead of taking them back upstairs, which meant she was expecting Clara to be there when she worked through them. None of it was said. Clara didn't remark on any of it because she understood instinctively that remarking on it would make everyone self-conscious and the whole thing would tighten back up like a fist. She just showed up every day and let the shift be what it was. Rose was the clearest change. The child who had twisted away from Clara's touch in that first week now sought her out with the uncomplicated directness of a child who has decided to trust someone and sees no reason to pretend otherwise. She appeared in the kitchen when Clara was working there. She brought her drawings to show her, careful crayon pictures of horses and the mountains, and once, a picture of a woman at a stove that was recognizably meant to be Clara, though the proportions were ambitious. She asked questions constantly in the way that 7-year-olds do, cycling through topics with no concern for transition. Why is the sky that color in the morning and a different color at night? Do horses dream? What was Ohio like? Was it pretty? Why doesn't Papa smile more? That last one Clara answered carefully. Some people keep their smiles for when they really mean them, she said. It doesn't mean they're not feeling things. Rose considered this with great seriousness. Like a savings jar, she said. You don't spend everything at once. Something like that. Rose nodded, satisfied, and went back to her drawing. The hair braiding had become a morning ritual. Rose would appear at Clara's door at 6:45, hair loose and tangled, and Clara would sit on the edge of the bed and work through it with her fingers first, and then the brush. And they would talk about whatever Rose wanted to talk about, which was usually a great deal. The braids Clara did were not elaborate, a simple French braid that Rose could keep neat through the day. But Rose had approved them decisively, and that was that. Lydia watched this ritual from the hallway doorway one morning with an expression she was trying to keep neutral and not entirely managing. Clara caught it and didn't say anything, and the next morning she left the door open a little wider. The third morning, Lydia was in the room before Rose, sitting in the chair by the window with her own hairbrush, not looking at Clara. Did you want me to do yours too? Clara asked, in the same ordinary voice she used for everything. You don't have to, Lydia said. I know I don't have to. A pause. All right then, Lydia said, and moved to the edge of the bed. Clara worked carefully because Lydia's hair was longer and thicker than Rose's, and also because she understood that this was something being given, not just a practical request, and she did not want to do anything that made Lydia regret it. They didn't talk much. Lydia sat straight-backed and still the way she always sat, but the rigidity in her shoulders was different from the cold rigidity of those first weeks. This was more like concentration, the focused stillness of someone trying to stay present in something unfamiliar. When Clara finished, Lydia reached up and touched the braid. It's like Mama used to do it, she said, and her voice was flat in the specific way that meant she was working to keep it flat. Clara didn't say anything for a moment. Then, Is that all right? I can do it differently. No, Lydia said. It's all right. She stood up and smoothed her skirt, and she left the room, and Clara heard her on the stairs going down to breakfast, and she let out a slow breath. Rose looked at her. She cried last night, she said, matter-of-factly. She thinks I'm asleep, but I hear her. That's hard, Clara said. She misses Mama the most because she's older and she remembers more. Rose said it with the blunt clarity children sometimes have about painful things. I only remember some things, like the smell of her coat, and how she laughed. She looked at the window. I can't remember her voice anymore, and I don't want to forget it more. Clara sat beside her on the bed. She didn't reach out this time. She let Rose decide about contact, and Rose leaned sideways against her arm the way a cat leans into warmth without making a thing of it. You won't forget her, Clara said. How do you know? Because you still remember the important parts. The laugh. The coat. That's not nothing, Rose. That's the parts that stay. Rose was quiet for a while. Then she sat up straight and announced she was hungry, and the moment was over the way those moments always are, complete and then gone, leaving something behind that didn't need to be named. December arrived with a cold that had actual teeth to it. The ranch work changed shape, different priorities, different pressures, the particular urgency of frontier winter that Clara was still learning to read. Nathaniel spent longer hours out with the men and came in later in the evenings, and when he did come in, he was tired in a bone-deep way that was different from his usual reserve. Clara made sure there was food kept warm for him, and she didn't wait up, because waiting up would have been a statement neither of them was ready to make. But she left the lamp on in the kitchen. She didn't analyze why. She just did it. They were finding their way towards something like a functional language, she and Nathaniel. Not warmth exactly, not yet, but a practical fluency that was its own kind of closeness. He told her things about the ranch now, without waiting for her to ask. What the South Pasture situation looked like, what the weather would mean for the cattle, whether a particular problem needed her help managing around it in the household. She told him things about the girls, not in the form of reports, but in the course of conversation, the way two people talk when they're managing something together. He came into the kitchen one evening when she was going over the household accounts and sat down across from her without being invited, which was new. Halston was in Harlan Creek again today, he said. Clara set down her pencil. What's he doing? Talking, mostly to the men who owned property near the south border. He put both hands flat on the table. A gesture she'd learned meant he was thinking through something he hadn't finished thinking through yet. He's been buying up water rights in the county for 2 years. He's got 3 ranches between here and the mountains that all need access to river water, and the Crow River is the piece that would connect all of it. So this isn't just about your land. It was never just about my land. He looked at her directly. He wants to control the water in this part of the territory. Do that and you control everything that depends on it. Farming, ranching, everything. Clara looked at the account book in front of her and thought about that. The shape of it, the logic. What's stopping him? Me, for now. A pause. And the fact that he needs it to look legal. Halston's careful that way. He doesn't take things. He arranges for things to become his. How? Makes the owner's life difficult enough that selling looks like the best option, or find something to hold over them. He said it without visible emotion, but she heard the weight in it. He's been trying to find something on me for 1.5 years. He hasn't found anything because there isn't anything to find. Clara thought about that. Then what's he looking for now? Nathaniel looked at the table for a moment, then at her. I don't know yet, but he's changed his approach recently. He's been asking about the household, about you. She was quiet. I heard it from the man at the feed store, Nathaniel said. Halston was in there asking questions about who you were, where you came from, what your family situation was before you came here. Clara felt something cool move through her, not quite fear, but adjacent to it. What kind of questions? The kind that are looking for a crack. She held his gaze. My father was in debt when he died. I didn't know about it until after, if that's what he's after. It's not a scandal to have had a father who made poor decisions with money, Nathaniel said. Half the men in this territory have done the same. His voice was even. What he's looking for is something that would give people a reason to doubt why you're here. They already doubt why I'm here. Yes. He didn't dress it up. But right now they're letting it lie because you've been here long enough to show yourself. What Halston wants is to give the doubt a story, something that looks like evidence. Clara picked up her pencil and set it down again. I haven't done anything wrong. I know that. Something about the simplicity of how he said it landed harder than she expected. Not I believe you, or I'm sure you haven't. Just I know that, flat and certain, the way you say a thing you don't need to qualify. She went back to the accounts. He stayed at the table for a while, not doing anything particular, and then he went to his office and she kept working, and the lamp burned between them in the quiet kitchen, and neither of them said anything more about it that night. The problem announced itself on a Thursday evening in the second week of December. Clara had spent the afternoon with the girls, reading with Rose, working through a geography lesson with Lydia that had gotten surprisingly interesting once Lydia decided she was genuinely curious about where Ohio was in relation to Montana and why people moved between places at all. They ate supper as usual, the four of them, and the meal was as close to ordinary as anything at Blackthorn Ranch had gotten in the 6 weeks she'd been there. Nathaniel talked a little about the cattle. Rose asked whether horses could live in cities, which led somewhere unexpected. Lydia ate her food without picking it apart and studying each piece, which was a recent development. After supper, Clara had gone to the kitchen and made a pot of something she'd been planning to do for a few days. A broth, heavy on herbs, the kind of thing her father had always wanted in winter because it helped his chest. She made enough for the whole household and ladled it into cups and brought them through. One for Mrs. Holt, who accepted it with a word of thanks that was closer to genuine than anything she'd offered in the first 2 weeks. One for Nathaniel in his office, one for Bess, and she set one out for herself. She was cleaning the pot when she started to feel wrong. It was gradual at first, a heaviness that she thought was tiredness, because she was always tired by this point in the evening. But it moved wrong, this feeling. It didn't settle the way fatigue settled. It spread into her hands and then up her arms, and her vision began to do something strange at the edges, a softening and brightening that didn't belong there. She set down the pot very carefully and held on to the edge of the counter. Clara? She turned. Nathaniel was in the doorway of the kitchen. She didn't know how long he'd been there. Something's, she started. Then the floor came up to meet her, and she didn't feel it. What she learned afterward, pieced together from what people told her, was that Nathaniel caught her before she hit the ground, that he called for Tom and Gus, and they brought the wagon around in under 10 minutes, because he didn't wait for morning and didn't wait to see if she'd recover on her own, that he sat beside her in the back of the wagon for the 2-hour ride to the nearest doctor, which was not in Harlan Creek. The Harlan Creek doctor was not equipped for this, Tom had said, and Nathaniel had made the decision for the farther town in the time it took most men to think about making it. That Mrs. Holt stayed with the girls and Lydia didn't sleep and Rose cried, and that when Gus came back with the wagon the next morning, the first person he saw was Lydia on the porch in her coat, waiting. What Clara knew at the time was nothing. Then cold and pain and a ceiling she didn't recognize, and Nathaniel sitting in a chair 2 feet away with his coat still on. She tried to say something, and what came out was not a word. "Don't," he said. Not harshly, just with the certainty of someone who has made a decision about what's going to happen next, and that decision is that she is going to lie still. She lay still. The doctor's name was Reeves, and he was a compact, serious man who spoke to Nathaniel in low voices that Clara couldn't quite follow, and she drifted in and out of the kind of sleep that isn't really sleep. Shallow, strange, with the sounds of the room coming through it at odd angles. When she woke properly, it was morning. Gray light through a window she didn't know. Her hands felt wrong. Her mouth tasted like metal. Nathaniel was still in the chair. "You didn't go home," she said. Her voice was rougher than she expected. "No." "The girls—" Gus went back, Mrs. Holtz with them. She looked at him. He looked back at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not quite fear, not quite anger, something tangled between them that he hadn't had time to sort into his usual order. "What happened to me?" she asked. He was quiet for a long moment. "Dr. Reeves says you were poisoned." The word landed in the room and stayed there. "Poisoned," she repeated. "Something in what you ate or drank last night." His voice was careful. "He says the symptoms are consistent with a plant compound, enough to make someone very sick. Possibly enough to—" He stopped, looked at his hands. "He says you were lucky that it was a smaller amount." Clara stared at the ceiling. She thought about the kitchen, the broth, the cups she'd set out for everyone. "Did anyone else get sick?" "No?" She looked at him. "Then it wasn't in the broth, or not in the pot?" "No." His jaw was set in the way it got when he was working very hard to stay level. "Dr. Reeves thinks it was in the cup. Your cup specifically." The shape of it settled over her slowly, the way cold water settles. Not all at once, but completely, getting into every part. Someone had put something in her cup, set out on the counter while she was at the stove with her back to the room. Her cup, which she had filled last and drunk alone in the kitchen after everyone else had gone. "Who was in the kitchen?" she said. It wasn't exactly a question. Bess came through to put something away. Mrs. Holt was in and out. He stopped. "And Tom says he saw a man near the kitchen window earlier in the evening, someone he didn't recognize." Clara closed her eyes. She thought about Halston, about what Nathaniel had said 2 weeks ago at the kitchen table. He doesn't take things. He arranges for things to become his. About the questions the man at the feed store had been asked. About the crack in the household that someone had been looking for. She thought about how easy she had been to get to. The new woman. The one everyone was still deciding about. The one whose cup nobody would think twice about being unattended for a few minutes in a busy kitchen. "He didn't do it himself," she said. "No," Nathaniel agreed. "He wouldn't." She opened her eyes and looked at the ceiling again. She was very tired, a different kind of tired than the bone-deep fatigue of work. This was hollowed out, scraped clean. "Are you sure it was him?" "I'm not sure of anything yet." His voice was the particular flatness of controlled anger. "But I intend to find out." "Nathaniel." She hadn't used his given name before. It came out without her planning it. "Whatever you're thinking about doing, don't do it without thinking it through first. He wants a reason to come at you directly. Don't give it to him." He looked at her sharply. "I've been poisoned," she said, "not lost my ability to think. He's careful. You said so yourself. Whatever he's arranged here, he'll have kept his hands clean. If you go after him angry, you're doing exactly what he's planned for." The sharpness faded into something more complicated. He was quiet for a long moment. "You're telling me to be patient." "I'm telling you to be smart." She held his gaze. "There's a difference." Something moved through his expression, through the layers of the controlled, closed-off man she'd been watching for 6 weeks, and came out the other side as something she didn't have a name for yet. Not gratitude, not relief. Something more fundamental than either of those. "Rest," he said finally. "I intend to." He stood up and refilled the glass of water beside her bed and set it close enough that she could reach it without stretching, and then he sat back down, and Clara understood that he was not going anywhere. She slept. Recovery was its own kind of misery. She spent 3 days at Dr. Reeves's before Nathaniel deemed it safe enough to move her, and then the wagon ride back was long and cold, and she was not steady enough to sit upright the whole way, which galled her considerably. She ended up leaning against the side panel of the wagon with Nathaniel's coat over her. He gave it up without comment when she started shivering. and she looked at the winter sky above Montana and felt, for the first time since arriving, genuinely frightened. Not of Halston, exactly. Of the vulnerability. Of how clean and easy it had been. She had walked into this household carrying the idea, not spoken, but carried, that she was here on her own terms, that she had chosen this and could unchoose it and was beholden to no one, that she was managing a situation rather than being part of one. It had been a way of protecting herself, that idea, a way of not needing things too much. And now someone had used her cup to send a message to Nathaniel Crow, and she understood that she was not separate from this family in any way that mattered anymore. Whatever she'd thought she was doing here, whatever contract she'd drawn up in her head, had become something else entirely, somewhere between the first morning in the kitchen and Rose's hands on her sleeve in the dark, and Lydia's back going from rigid to something softer under her fingers. She was in it, fully in it, and someone had tried to hurt her for exactly that reason. They arrived at Blackthorn Ranch in the afternoon. Rose appeared on the porch while the wagon was still coming through the gate, and she came down the steps at a speed that Clara recognized as barely controlled running. Lydia came behind her more slowly, hands clasped at the front of her coat, face doing the controlled neutral thing. But she was at the porch rail before the wagon stopped, and her eyes didn't leave Clara. Tom helped Clara down from the wagon because her legs were still not to be fully trusted, and she accepted it without her usual resistance because she was tired and because Rose was already beside her, slipping her hand into Clara's without asking. "You're cold," Rose said. "I'm all right." "Are you going to be sick again?" "No." She looked down at the girl. "I'm going to be fine." Rose looked at her with the particular scrutiny of someone who has already been through losing a person they loved and is not prepared to do it again. "You promise?" Clara made herself hold that gaze. "I'm going to do my best," she said, because promising things about the future was not something she was willing to do carelessly. Rose seemed to accept this. She kept hold of Clara's hand and walked beside her into the house. Lydia held the door open as they came in. She didn't say anything. She had her father's way with silence. But as Clara passed her in the doorway, Lydia reached out and briefly, almost accidentally looking, touched Clara's arm. A light, quick pressure, the kind you could pretend not to notice, and then it was gone. Clara noticed. She was installed in her room with Mrs. Holt's complete and efficient management, which now carried something warmer behind it. The woman had been frightened, Clara could tell, in a way she wasn't going to talk about and didn't have to. She brought up soup at noon and tea in the afternoon and changed the bedding out with the brisk, no-nonsense energy of someone who copes with distress by being immediately practical, which Clara respected enormously. Tom came up to tell her that the man he'd seen near the kitchen window had been identified. One of the men who worked at the livery in Harlan Creek, a man who had been hired there 3 months ago, coincidentally around the time Halston had started his new approach. Tom said this without editorializing, but his expression said the rest. Nathaniel came up in the evening with this information organized in the flat, careful way he organized things that he was angry about. He stood in the doorway of her room. He had not come inside it before, and he told her what they'd found. The liveryman had been paid, the payment could be traced, and there were 2 witnesses who had seen him near the ranch kitchen at the relevant time. "Is that enough?" Clara asked. "To convict Halston of arranging it?" He looked grim. "Not yet. The man at the livery has already left town, probably persuaded to leave." "Halston's cleaning house." "He is," she thought. "Then you need him to do something directly. Something where he can't use someone else as the hand." "He won't." "No," she agreed. "Not unless he thinks he has to. Not unless he thinks you're close enough to something that waiting is worse than moving." She looked at him. "Is there something he's afraid you know?" Nathaniel was quiet for a moment that had weight in it. "There's something," she said. "What is it?" He came into the room just a few steps, and he stood there with his arms crossed, and he looked at her in the lamplight with the expression of a man making a decision about how much to say. "There's a deed," he said finally, "for a property on the southern edge of the county. It belonged to a family named Croft. Halston acquired it 2 years ago. And the Crofts didn't want to sell. I know that because Jim Croft told me so, the summer before they left the territory. He said they'd been sold out from under themselves, that someone had forged a debt record and used it to force the sale through a county official, Halston. He arranged it through a third party, but Jim Croft said there was a document, something the third party had drawn up, that had Halston's mark on it, a private transaction record that never made it into the county filing. Clara felt the shape of this. And you think that document still exists? I think Jim Croft kept it. He looked at her carefully. I wrote to him last month, before any of this. He wrote back saying he still had it and would consider showing it to the right person. Then you have something, she said. It's not enough on its own. It's one man's word and one questionable document. It's a beginning. She looked at the window. Outside, for 6 weeks, felt suddenly much closer to the surface. Not just practical partnership, not just the careful working relationship they'd constructed, but something that required more careful handling than either of them had been prepared for. You should be resting, he said, and his voice had something in it she hadn't heard before. I've been in bed for 4 days, she said. My mind is the only part of me that's recovered. Then rest your body and let your mind do what it needs to do. He moved toward the door. I'll look at the Croft letter tomorrow. And the livery man. I'll handle it. Nathaniel. He stopped. She held his gaze. Thank you. For not going home that night. He looked at her, and the expression on his face was one she understood. It was the expression of someone who has realized, probably earlier than they wanted to, that they no longer have the option of not caring about something. That the distance they'd carefully maintained has closed, without their permission, while they were doing other things. He said good night and went downstairs, and Clara lay back against the pillow and looked at the ceiling of her room. Outside, the wind was moving across the land with the particular loneliness of Montana winter nights, wide and empty and indifferent to everything. But inside the house, there were other sounds. Lydia's footsteps crossing the floor above, Rose talking to herself in the way she did before sleep, the distant movement of the household settling around her. She had come here 6 weeks ago with a suitcase and a worn photograph and a letter, and she had arrived in a place that didn't want her in a household that had no use for her and a man who had needed a practical solution to a practical problem. None of that was exactly what she had now. What she had now was a household that had left a lamp burning in the kitchen for her, a 10-year-old who had touched her arm in a doorway like it was the most ordinary thing in the world, a 7-year-old's hand in hers on the walk from the wagon, a man who had sat in a chair all night in his coat because he couldn't bring himself to leave. And somewhere out there, Victor Halston was calculating the distance between a forged debt record and a poisoned cup, adding things up in the way careful men added things up, and reaching conclusions about how to finish what he'd started. Clara stared at the ceiling and thought about the Croft letter, and the county official, and the private transaction document with Halston's mark on it. She thought about what it would take to bring it all into the light. She thought about Nathaniel's jaw set in controlled anger, and the way he'd refilled her water glass and set it where she could reach it. She was not, she told herself, afraid. She was, she admitted honestly, to herself, in the dark, where there was no one to see it, afraid. She was afraid in the way you are when you finally found a place worth fighting for, and you realize just how serious the fight is going to get. But she had learned something about herself in the 6 weeks at Blackthorn Ranch, that afraid and done were two very different things. She closed her eyes. She let the sounds of the house settle around her. Rose's voice quieting, Lydia's footsteps stilling, the wind going on its indifferent way outside. She was still here. That was what she had to work with, and it was enough. She was back on her feet by the end of the week. Not fully. Her strength came back in stages, uneven and frustrating, and there were mornings when she pushed too hard and paid for it by mid-afternoon, needing to sit down somewhere and wait for the dizzy spells to pass. She didn't mention these episodes to anyone. She had enough people watching her carefully already, and she did not want to give the household more reason to treat her like something fragile. What she wanted was to get back to the work, and to the particular steadiness that came from doing useful things, and to figure out what Victor Halston was going to try next before he tried it. Nathaniel had written to Jim Croft the day after their conversation in her room, a second letter, more direct than the first. He told Clara this at breakfast, matter-of-factly, while Lydia and Rose were still eating and wouldn't attach too much significance to it. Croft lived 3 counties east now, on a smaller piece of land, and the reply would take at least a week to arrive. In the meantime, Nathaniel had sent Gus quietly to talk to 2 men he trusted on the county board. Not to file anything, not yet, but to establish that there was a relationship there before it was needed. "You're being careful," Clara said. "I'm being what you told me to be," he said, and he picked up his coffee and looked out the window, and Clara allowed herself a small measure of satisfaction at that. Halston's next move came not through any back channel or hired intermediary. It came through the front door of public opinion, which was, as Nathaniel had said, the man's preferred weapon. It started with a woman named Dorothea Marsh. Clara had encountered her once in Harlan Creek, in the general store, 3 weeks after arriving. A tall woman in her 50s with the bearing of someone who had always been the most important woman in any room she entered, and who intended to remain so. She had looked at Clara with the particular assessment of a small-town matriarch, taken in the suitcase and the Eastern coat and the unfamiliar face, and said something pleasant and precise that Clara had recognized immediately as a test. Clara had passed it, she thought, or at least not failed it, obviously. They had spoken briefly and gone their separate ways. What Clara hadn't known then was that Dorothea Marsh had been a friend of Nathaniel's first wife, that she considered herself a kind of guardian of the Crow family's reputation, which she had expanded in her mind to include oversight of its composition, that she had opinions about mail-order arrangements, which were not positive, and had been keeping those opinions in reserve, waiting to see what kind of woman Nathaniel had imported from Ohio before deploying them. Halston gave her the story she needed. Claire heard about it from Tom, who heard it from the feed store owner's wife, who had been in the Marsh parlor when it happened. Halston had gone to call on Dorothea, a social call, properly arranged, and in the course of conversation had mentioned, with the concerned air of a man sharing difficult information reluctantly, that Clara Whitmore had come west under false pretenses, that her family in Ohio had not simply been reduced by circumstance, but had been involved in a debt scheme that had cost several people their savings, that Clara herself had known about it, that the reason she'd accepted Nathaniel's arrangement so quickly was that she'd needed to get out of Ohio before questions caught up with her. None of it was true. Every piece of it was constructed from the real facts of her situation, the debt, the collapsed household, the speed of her departure, bent just enough to suggest something different from what they actually meant. Dorothea Marsh, to her credit or discredit depending on how you looked at it, did not immediately spread the story. She asked questions first. She sent a discreet note to a woman she knew in Columbus, Ohio, asking about the Whitmore name. She made inquiries through the kind of social networks that small-town women of her generation maintained across enormous distances, a web of correspondence that Clara would not have guessed existed. What the Columbus woman wrote back was that Clara Whitmore's father had been a well-regarded schoolteacher who had died owing money to 2 tradesmen, and that Clara herself had left for the West shortly after his death, and that no one who knew the family had anything ill to say about either of them. This should have ended it. Instead, Dorothea Marsh decided she had enough ambiguity to call a social gathering. The invitation arrived at Blackthorn Ranch on a Tuesday. A note, handwritten, requesting the presence of Mr. Crow and his intended at a tea at the Marsh House in Harlan Creek that Saturday, along with what sounded like most of the respectable households in the territory. The phrasing was polished and pleasant. The intention underneath it was not. Nathaniel read the note at breakfast and set it down with the expression Clara had come to know as his working through something face. "You don't have to go," he said. "Of course I have to go," Clara said. He looked at her. "If we don't go, it reads as having something to hide," she said. "If we go, at least I'm in the room. It will not be comfortable." "No," she agreed. "It won't be." She poured more coffee. "What do you know about Dorothea Marsh?" He considered the question with appropriate seriousness. She was devoted to Ellen. After Ellen died, she checked on the girls a few times in the first year. She means well, in general, but she has strong ideas about how things ought to be done, and she's not accustomed to having those ideas questioned. "Does she like you?" "She respects me. Whether she likes me, I couldn't say." "Did she like your first wife?" "Very much." Clara nodded slowly. Then this isn't malice on her part. She's frightened that someone's going to take advantage of your family. She looked at him directly. She's not entirely wrong to worry about that, in general. She's just wrong about which direction the threat is coming from. He was quiet for a moment. What are you planning? Nothing dramatic, she said. I'm planning to go to a tea and tell the truth and let people make their own decisions. She stood and started clearing the plates, because the girls would be down any minute, and she didn't want this conversation to run into them. The truth is generally the most boring option, which means Halston didn't plan for it. He almost said something to that. She could see it. The beginning of a response that got most of the way to his face and then got redirected. What he said instead was, I'll have Tom get the good wagon ready for Saturday. Thank you, she said, and went to the kitchen. She spent Thursday and Friday being more afraid than she'd admitted to Nathaniel and working through it the only way she knew how, which was to stay extremely busy. She went over everything in her head, every piece of her history, every fact about her father's situation, every letter she'd exchanged with Nathaniel before coming west. Not because she was looking for things to hide, because she wanted to know exactly what she was walking into and what ammunition existed and where it came from. On Friday evening, Lydia found her at the kitchen table with a glass of water, not drinking it, just sitting. Are you worried about Saturday? Lydia asked. She had come down for water herself and stood in the doorway in her nightgown. A little, Clara said, because lying to Lydia had always seemed both useless and unworthy. Lydia came and sat down across from her. It was unusual. The girl had not sought out conversation with Clara that way before, had always let herself be found rather than doing the finding. She tucked her feet up under her nightgown and looked at Clara with the direct measuring look that was one of the things Clara had come to genuinely appreciate about her. Mrs. Marsh knew my mother, Lydia said. I know. She used to come sometimes, after Mama died. She'd bring food and sit with Papa for a while. He never talked much to her, but she came anyway. Lydia turned her water glass in circles on the table. She's not a bad person. I don't think she is either. She's going to say bad things about you on Saturday. She might, Clara said. Does it scare you? Clara thought about how to answer that honestly. What scares me is the idea that people who don't know me will believe something untrue, she said. Not because of what it costs me personally, because untrue things have a way of getting into everything. Once people believe a story, it's hard to get the real one back. Lydia absorbed this. My teacher last year told me that the truth doesn't always win, she said, that sometimes the loudest story wins. Your teacher was right, Clara said, which is why I'm going to tell my story as clearly as I can and make sure it's the one people remember. She looked at the girl. I've done nothing wrong, Lydia. That's the simplest version of it. I came here honestly. I've tried to be useful. That's all. Lydia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, with the careful deliberateness of someone offering something they're not sure about, I'll tell Mrs. Marsh that you braided my hair. Clara looked at her. If she doesn't believe you, Lydia said, I'll tell her myself. That you stayed up with Rose when she was sick. That you didn't make me do anything or pretend to be something you weren't. She said it into the table, not into Clara's face, which was probably the only way she could say it. I'm 10, so it might not count very much. But I'll say it. Clara did not reach across and hug her, because that would have been too much, and Lydia would have gone rigid with the too muchness of it. She just held what had been offered and let it sit there between them, and she said, quietly, Thank you. Lydia uncurled her legs and stood up. Don't let them say things that aren't true without saying something back, she said, with the authority of someone who has figured out an important rule for living. Then she took her water and went upstairs, and Clara sat in the kitchen for a while longer, and something that had been sitting tight in her chest since Tuesday loosened, just slightly. Saturday came with cold, clear light, the particular winter brightness of Montana that had no warmth in it but was almost painfully sharp, so you could see everything for miles. Nathaniel drove the wagon himself, without Tom, which Clara understood as a statement about the nature of the occasion. She sat beside him on the bench in her best dress, the dark gray wool that had been her good dress in Ohio, and was probably the least impressive thing in the territory, and she thought, it's a good thing I'm not trying to win on appearance. I want to say something before we get there, Nathaniel said, about halfway to town. All right. He kept his eyes on the road. When I wrote to the registry and arranged this, when I wrote those letters to you, I had a particular picture of what the arrangement would look like. I told myself it was a practical matter, that we were both adults who needed something the other could provide, and that was sufficient. Clara waited. I was wrong about what it would become, he said. I don't know exactly when I understood that, but I understand it now. He was quiet for a moment. Whatever they say in there today, I want you to know that this is not what I told myself it was going to be. That you are not what I expected. And that has nothing to do with being better or worse than expected. It's just different. More. He stopped. He had run out of either words or willingness, and he looked uncomfortable in the particular way of a man who has said more than he planned to and is now exposed on a road in the cold with no way to take it back. Clara looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at the road ahead. I know, she said. Me too. He didn't say anything else. Neither did she, but something that had been held at a careful arm's length between them shifted, and they rode the rest of the way to Harlan Creek in a silence that was different from the silences they'd started with. The Marsh House was the largest in Harlan Creek proper, white-painted, 2 stories, with a parlor big enough to hold 20 people, which it was now holding something close to. Clara counted faces as they came in. The feed store owner and his wife, the doctor from town, 2 families she recognized from the general store, a magistrate whose name she'd heard Nathaniel mention once, and several others she didn't know. Every face in the room tracked them the moment they walked through the door, with the particular quality of attention that meant everyone already knew this was not a purely social occasion. Dorothea Marsh received them at the door herself. She was dressed immaculately, which Clara had expected, and her expression was the considered pleasantness of someone managing a difficult situation with practiced skill. "Mr. Crow," she said, "and Miss Whitmore." She looked at Clara with eyes that were intelligent and not unkind but were absolutely assessing. "I'm glad you came." "We wouldn't miss it," Clara said. They were shown into the parlor. Tea was poured. For the first 20 minutes, it was a perfectly ordinary social gathering, everyone talking about the winter and the cattle prices and a bridge over the North Creek that needed repair. Clara talked when spoken to, listened when not, and ate nothing, because she was not going to eat or drink anything in a public setting until this particular situation had resolved itself. She was aware of the room's temperature toward her. Polite, all of it, but with an undercurrent, the way a pond is polite on the surface, with something unresolved moving through it down below. Several women greeted her with the specific courtesy that means they've heard something and haven't decided yet. The magistrate shook her hand and looked at her too carefully. The feed store owner's wife asked where she was from in Ohio in a tone that was just slightly too interested. Victor Halston was not there. Of course he wasn't. He was careful. It was the doctor, an older man named Morrison, white-haired and deliberate, who brought it to a head. He waited until tea had been refilled and the general conversation had reached a natural pause, and then he said, in the measured tone of a man raising a subject he believes should be raised, "Miss Whitmore, I wonder if you might tell us a bit about your family in Ohio. Only that several of us were acquainted with the Crow family before, with Ellen, that is, and we feel a natural interest in the people who come into their lives." The room went very slightly quieter. Clara set down her teacup. She looked at Dr. Morrison without any particular expression. "My father was a school teacher," she said. "He taught for 22 years. He was well liked by his students and respected by the families in our town. He died last winter of pneumonia, and when he died I discovered he had debts I hadn't known about. 2 loans against the house, a balance with a tradesman. Nothing criminal, nothing fraudulent. The decisions of a man who had tried to maintain a decent life on a teacher's salary for 20 years and had run short at the end of it." The room was quiet now. "When I answered Mr. Crow's letter," she continued, "I told him exactly who I was and what my situation was. He made an informed decision. I made an informed decision. I came here with nothing hidden, and I have done nothing since I arrived that I wouldn't account for to any person in this room." She paused. "If someone has suggested otherwise, I'd be grateful to know what specifically they've said so I can address it directly." Dorothea Marsh, to her credit, did not look away. "There were suggestions," she said carefully, "that your departure from Ohio was rushed, that there were questions left behind you." The The question left behind me was whether the house could cover the debts, Clara said. It couldn't. The answer was to sell it. I did. I settled what I could, and I left, because there was nothing left to stay for. She looked at Dorothea directly. Mrs. Marsh, I know you cared for this family. I know that's why you're concerned. I'd ask you to consider whether the person raising these suggestions has this family's interests in mind, or his own. The magistrate, who had been listening with his hands folded, said quietly, Are you referring to Victor Halston? Nathaniel spoke then, for the first time since they'd arrived. He had been sitting beside Clara, still as a fence post, and when he spoke, the room rearranged itself around his voice, the way rooms did when a person who rarely spoke chose to. I'm referring to Victor Halston, he said, who has been trying to acquire the south pasture of my ranch for 2 years, and who, when I refused to sell, began looking for other means of pressure. He paused. 2 weeks ago, Miss Whitmore was poisoned. In my kitchen. The man responsible has been identified as a livery worker from this town who was employed here 3 months ago, around the time Halston changed his approach to this situation. The room had gone completely still. I don't have enough to bring a legal case today, Nathaniel said. I want to be clear about that. But I also want to be clear about this. Whatever story has been brought to you about Miss Whitmore, consider its source. Consider what that source has to gain from removing her from my household. And consider that a woman who was poisoned 2 weeks ago in my house came here today anyway and told you the truth plainly, because that's what she does. There was a long silence. Then Gus, who was not supposed to be at a social gathering and whose presence Clara hadn't registered until this moment, he was standing near the back of the room, hat in his hand, having apparently ridden in separately and let himself in the side door, said in his flat and unhurried way, I've worked for Mr. Crow 11 years. I've known a lot of people come through that ranch. Miss Whitmore's been there 6 weeks, and she's the only person who ever walked the south fence with me without being asked and noticed the broken post before I did. He turned his hat in his hands. I don't know anything about Ohio, but I know she works, and she doesn't lie. And she kept that little girl alive when she was sick in November. That's what I know. The feed store owner's wife said, She sat with my Bess last month when the girl spilled the linens in the mud. Spent 2 hours in the cold redoing the whole wash so Mrs. Holt wouldn't be angry. Clara had not known that anyone outside the ranch had heard about that. Tom, who was also apparently in the room, she was going to have to ask Nathaniel about this later, said from somewhere near the window, She asked every man's name on the ranch in her first week. Not to be polite, because she actually wanted to know. It was not a trial. It was not a public vindication, nothing so neat as that. It was just people saying the small true things they knew, in a parlor in Harlan Creek in December, while Dorothea Marsh sat with her teacup and listened. After a moment, Mrs. Marsh set her cup down. She looked at Clara with an expression that had moved through several things while the room was talking, and had arrived somewhere more honest than where it had started. Ellen would have liked you, I think, she said. She had very little patience for pretense. Clara held her gaze. That sounds like a woman worth knowing. Something shifted in Dorothea Marsh's face, and grief, quickly managed, the habitual grief of someone who has been managing it for years. She was, she said. She very much was. She straightened slightly, the matriarch returning. I owe you an apology, Miss Whitmore. I should have asked you directly before I allowed other people's stories to sit in my house. You didn't know me, Claire said. You were protecting a family you care about. I'd rather someone protect them badly than not at all. It was the right thing to say, and they both knew it. The gathering ended without resolution of anything large. Halston was not arrested, no legal proceedings were launched, the south pasture was still in dispute. But the temperature of the room had changed, and the temperature of rooms in small towns was not a small thing. People who had come in with a story floating in their heads left with something different in its place, and Clara understood, from watching her father navigate the social complexities of a small Ohio town for her entire childhood, that this was how the ground shifted, not all at once, not dramatically, but person by person, in parlors and general stores, and across the distance of a polite greeting that was either genuine or not. On the ride back to the ranch, Nathaniel said, You knew Gus was going to be there. I didn't know, she said. I hoped. He glanced at her sideways. You mentioned to him yesterday that you thought it would be a difficult afternoon. I mentioned it in the context of a completely separate conversation about the North Pasture Gate, in a way that led somehow to him deciding to come to a social gathering he has never in 11 years attended. Gus makes his own decisions, Clara said. She could feel him looking at her with an expression she was too tired to interpret properly, and she looked at the road ahead and watched the winter light going flat over the mountains, and tried not to be too obvious about the fact that her hands were shaking slightly now that it was over. "You were frightened," he said, not accusing, just noting it. "Yes." "You didn't look it." "I've had a lot of practice not looking it." He was quiet for a moment, then, "Clara." "Yes." "The Croft letter arrived this morning. I didn't want to tell you before the gathering because I didn't want you distracted." He paused. "Jim Croft has the document. He's willing to present it to the county magistrate in person. He'll travel here in January if we can arrange it." Clara felt something loosen in her chest. "That's enough," she said. "That's enough to start." "It's a start," he agreed, "not a finish. Halston is going to know you've contacted Croft. When Croft arrives, he'll know for certain." "Yes." She looked at him. "Then we need to be ready for what he does when he's cornered." "I've been thinking about that." He kept his eyes on the road, but his jaw had the set of someone who has been making decisions. "I spoke to Morrison before we left, the doctor. He's agreed to provide his testimony about your poisoning in writing, if it comes to that." "And the magistrate?" "He asked me to come see him Monday morning." A pause. "He didn't look like a man who was going to say no to what I'm going to ask him." Clara looked out at the land. The enormous, cold, indifferent Montana land that had been outside her window every morning for 6 weeks and still sometimes caught her off guard with its scale. She thought about the South Pasture and the river running through it, and 3 ranching families who needed that water access to survive. She thought about the Crofts, sold out of their own land, living smaller now 3 counties east. She thought about a cup on a kitchen counter and the particular shape of a man who used other people's hands to do his work. She thought about Lydia at the kitchen table on Friday night, feet tucked under her nightgown, saying, "I'll tell Mrs. Marsh that you braided my hair." "Nathaniel," she said. "Yes." "When this is finished—" She stopped, started again. "When we've dealt with Halston properly, what happens then? With us? With the arrangement?" He didn't answer right away, and she didn't rush him, because the question deserved to land properly before he tried to answer it. "What do you want to happen?" he asked. She had thought about this in the way she thought about difficult things, methodically, late at night, going around the edges of it before she could look at the center. She had thought about the life she'd come west to escape and the life she had found instead, which was harder and stranger and more real than anything she had imagined. She had thought about Rose's hand in hers and Lydia's touch in the doorway and the lamp left burning in the kitchen and a man who had sat all night in a chair in his coat because he couldn't bring himself to leave. "I want to stay," she said. "Not because I need somewhere to stay, because I want this particular place." She paused. "That's the first time I've said that clearly, even to myself." The wagon moved through the last mile to the ranch in the fading light. The gate came into view, the barn behind it, the lamp already lit in the kitchen window because Mrs. Holt always lit it before dark now. "I'm not easy to know," Nathaniel said. It wasn't an apology. It was a warning, the honest kind. "I noticed," Clara said. "I'm still here." He pulled the wagon through the gate. The ranch closed around them. The sounds of it, the smell of it, the particular weight of the place that had been nothing to her 6 weeks ago and was now something she couldn't name and didn't need to. Rose was on the porch again, coat on, waiting. She came down the steps when she saw them, not running this time, just walking steadily out to meet them the way she had started doing, as if this was a thing she'd always done and would keep doing. "Mrs. Marsh didn't say anything bad, did she?" she asked when Clara climbed down. "She said your mother would have liked me," Clara said. Rose considered this with the gravity it deserved. "She would have," she said. "Mama liked people who did things." Clara looked at her. This 7-year-old who saw things as simply as they were, and felt something that she had been being careful about name itself, plainly and without permission, in the center of her chest. She took Rose's hand and walked into the house. Behind her she could hear Nathaniel on the porch steps, and the particular sound of him pausing there for a moment before following them inside. She did not look back. She didn't need to. The kitchen was warm. The lamp was burning. Mrs. Holt had something on the stove that smelled like the beginning of a good dinner, and Lydia was at the table with her school books, and she looked up when Clara came in and said, with studied casualness, "How did it go?" "Well enough," Clara said, and sat down across from her, and the kitchen settled around them both with the particular fullness of a room that has the right number of people in it. Outside, Harlan Creek was 3 miles away and Victor Halston was somewhere in it, calculating. The Croft letter was in Nathaniel's desk. January was coming, and with it, whatever came next. But right now, the stove was warm and the lamp was lit, and Clara Whitmore was sitting in the kitchen of Blackthorn Ranch, listening to Rose ask Lydia an impossible question about horses, and Lydia answering it with more patience than she would have managed 2 months ago. And she thought, this is what it is to have somewhere to be. Not safe, not finished, not even fully formed yet, but real, and worth every hard thing it was going to take to keep it. January came in hard, the kind of cold that made the barn timbers crack at night and turned the water in the yard trough to solid ice before sunrise. Clara had learned by now to dress in layers before her feet hit the floor. 2 pairs of stockings, the heavy wool skirt, the coat she'd bought in November that was nothing elegant but kept the wind out. She had stopped thinking about what she looked like in the mornings and started thinking entirely about what the day required, which was a shift she hadn't anticipated when she'd come west, but which felt now like something she'd been moving toward for a long time without knowing it. Jim Croft arrived on a Wednesday, 3 days into the new year. He was older than Clara had pictured from the way Nathaniel described him, somewhere past 60, weathered in the particular way of men who have worked land their whole lives and then lost it, which leaves a different mark than ordinary aging. He came by horse from the east, alone, and when he rode into the yard at Blackthorn Ranch, he sat in the saddle for a moment looking at the house and the barn and the fencing that ran out to the horizon, and his expression was the expression of a man looking at something he recognized and had been forced to leave behind in a different form. Clara brought him inside and made coffee and let Nathaniel handle the conversation while she stayed close enough to listen without making it a formal thing. Croft was quiet at first, careful the way people are careful when they've traveled a long way for something that matters and are not yet sure it's going to go the way they need it to. He drank his coffee and looked at the table and didn't say much. Then Nathaniel put the letter on the table, his own letter to Croft, and Croft's reply, and said, "I need to know if you're still willing." Croft looked at the letters. He looked at his hands. "Halston's a dangerous man to be on the wrong side of," he said. "I've been on his wrong side before. That's why I'm 3 counties east living on 40 acres instead of my own land." "I know that," Nathaniel said. "I'm not asking you to carry this alone. I'll be standing beside you when you go in front of the magistrate. And if it doesn't work, if the document's not enough, then we're in the same position we're in now, but we tried." Nathaniel's voice was level. "But I think it's enough. Morrison has his testimony in writing. The magistrate asked questions after the marsh gathering that a man asks when he's already halfway to a conclusion. And the document you have puts Halston's mark on a transaction he's claimed publicly he had nothing to do with." Croft was quiet for a long moment. He turned his coffee cup in circles. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his coat and took out an envelope, worn at the edges, and set it on the table. "My wife told me to burn this 2 years ago," he said. "She said holding on to it would only keep us angry, and it couldn't bring the land back." He looked at the envelope. "She was probably right about the angry part, but I kept it anyway." Nathaniel didn't touch the envelope. "What's in it?" "A transaction record, written up by a man named Dale Purvis, who worked for Halston at the time as a kind of agent, I suppose you'd call him. The record details the arrangement Halston made with the county clerk to misfile our debt records. Purvis signed it. Halston countersigned. Croft's voice was steady, the steadiness of something that has been felt so many times it's been worn smooth. Purvis died the following year. Cholera, supposedly. I never asked too many questions about that. The kitchen was quiet except for the stove. Clara, from her position near the counter, said, "Mr. Croft, did anyone else ever see that document besides you and your wife?" Croft looked at her. My wife showed it to her brother before she died. He lives in Billings. I wrote to him last month to let him know what I was planning. Does he still remember what he saw? He's got a good memory. And he wrote back saying if I needed him to say so in front of a magistrate, he would. Clara looked at Nathaniel. Nathaniel looked at her. Something moved between them. Not a signal, exactly, but the particular fluency of two people who have been thinking about the same problem from different angles long enough to understand each other without having to explain. That's 3 witnesses and a document, Clara said. That's not nothing. The meeting with the magistrate happened on Friday. Clara did not go. It was not her place to go, and she knew it. This was legal and territorial and required the presence of men whose word carried weight in that particular room, and inserting herself would have complicated things without improving them. She stayed at the ranch with the girls, and she kept herself busy with the accounts and the kitchen and a conversation with Lydia about geography that she did not fully follow because half her attention was on the road to Harlan Creek. Rose appeared at her elbow around noon with the solemnity of a child who understands that something important is happening without knowing exactly what. "Will Papa be back for dinner?" she asked. "I expect so," Clara said. "Is it going to be all right?" Clara looked at her. There were things you said to children to make them feel better that were not quite true, and things that were true that weren't quite appropriate, and somewhere between them was the honest answer that treated a child as someone capable of handling reality. "I think so," she said. "Your father is prepared. He's done this carefully. But you don't know for certain." "No, I don't know for certain." Rose considered this with the seriousness that had become characteristic of her, that thoughtful gravity that her illness and her grief had deposited in her, making her older than 7 in some ways while remaining entirely 7 in others. "I don't like not knowing things," she said. "Nobody does," Claire said. "But not knowing and not being ready are different. We're ready." Rose seemed to accept this. She climbed onto the stool at the kitchen counter and watched Clara work and asked 3 questions about bread making that were genuine and 2 that were purely a way of staying in the room, and Clara answered all 5 with equal seriousness. Nathaniel came back at 4 o'clock. He came into the kitchen still in his coat, and Clara looked at his face and read it the way she had learned to read it over these months. Not the surface of it, which was always controlled, but the space behind his eyes, where he was less careful. "Well," he said, "tell me." He sat down at the kitchen table. He took off his hat and set it on the table and ran a hand through his hair, which was something she'd only seen him do twice before, both times when he was more tired than he wanted anyone to know. The magistrate reviewed the document. He brought in a man from the county land office to look at the filing records Croft described. The misfiling was real. They found it in about 20 minutes once they knew what they were looking for. Clara put down what she was holding. "And Halston? He's been summoned to appear before a territorial judge in February. The county clerk who did the original misfiling has already admitted to it. Apparently he'd been carrying that for 2 years and didn't need much pressure." Nathaniel looked at the table. "There will be a full proceeding. Croft's land situation will be reviewed. The Croft brother and Billings will be contacted." He paused. "It won't be finished in a month. These things take time." "But it started." "It started." He looked up at her. "Halston knows. His lawyer was there. He sat in that office and listened to it all, and he kept himself very controlled the way he does. But at the end he said something to his lawyer that—" Nathaniel stopped. "He knows it's over. He doesn't have the clerk anymore. He doesn't have the document. He doesn't have the story he was building about you." His voice was even, but something underneath it was not. "He had the magistrate and half the county board in his pocket for 2 years, and he's lost them in an afternoon because a man kept a piece of paper his wife told him to burn." Clara sat down across from him. The kitchen was quiet, the afternoon light going gold and flat through the window. "Is he dangerous now?" she asked. "Cornered men. Morrison has already spoken to the sheriff. There will be someone watching." Nathaniel met her eyes. "He's careful, Clara. Even now he'll be careful. His whole value to himself is that he stays on the right side of legal appearances. The moment he does something direct, he loses the one thing he has left." She nodded slowly. Then she looked at him. really looked at him, the way she rarely let herself look at him directly without something practical to focus on. He was tired in the bone-deep way, and there was something else under the tiredness. Relief, maybe, or the feeling after relief when the tension has finally let go and the body doesn't quite know what to do without it. "You did it," she said. "We had the right pieces. I just put them in front of the right people." "Nathaniel," he looked at her. "You did it," she said again quietly. "Accept that." Something moved across his face, the particular expression of a man who is not accustomed to being told to receive something good without immediately converting it into the next task. He looked at his hat on the table. He looked at her, and then, slowly, in the way that things happen with him, without announcement, without performance, he let out a breath that seemed to come from somewhere well below his chest. "Yes," he said. "All right." Rose appeared in the kitchen doorway with Lydia behind her. They had heard the wagon come in, and they had been waiting in the way children wait when they know something important has happened, gathered at the edge of it, trying to read the room. "Well?" Lydia said. Her voice was steady, her father's daughter, but her hands were clasped in front of her in the way they got when she was less steady than she looked. Nathaniel looked at both his daughters. "It's going to be all right," he said. "It's going to take time, but it's going to be all right." Rose came across the kitchen and put her arms around him without ceremony, the way she had started doing in recent weeks, not with the desperate grip of a child afraid of losing something, but with the uncomplicated ease of someone who has remembered that this is an available thing. Nathaniel put his arm around her and held her with the slightly unpracticed care of a man who is learning to do this again after a long time of not doing it. Lydia stayed in the doorway, but she was smiling, briefly and privately, in a way she probably didn't know showed. Clara stood and went to the stove and kept her back to the room for a moment, because some things deserve to be private even when you are in the middle of them, and because she needed a moment herself. A small, quiet moment with her hands on the edge of the stove and the heat coming up to meet them. To feel what it felt like when something difficult had finally turned the right way. She had never been a person who believed the right thing was automatically going to happen. She had watched too many wrong things happen to people who deserved better. Her father, the Crofts, half a dozen situations she'd known growing up in a world that distributed its hardships without fairness or logic. She did not believe in easy outcomes or guaranteed justice. What she believed in was doing the work and staying in the room and telling the truth clearly and letting it be enough or not enough because that was all you had. Today, it had been enough. She was going to let herself feel that without immediately converting it into worry about tomorrow. The territorial proceedings against Victor Halston took 4 months. Clara was not present for most of them. There was a ranch to run and children to raise, and daily life did not pause because something important was happening in a courthouse in the county seat. She followed it through what Nathaniel told her in the evenings, and what Gus heard in Harlan Creek, and what occasional letters from the magistrate's office made its way to the ranch. It was slow and procedural and deeply unglamorous, which is what justice actually looks like when it's working. Not a dramatic confrontation, but a long accumulation of documentation and testimony and careful argument. The county clerk's admission was the cornerstone. Once he had admitted to misfiling the Croft debt records under Halston's arrangement, 2 other instances surfaced. Other landowners, other manipulated documents, a pattern that had been invisible when each case stood alone and became very clear when someone finally put them in a row. The Croft brother in Billings came in person, as promised, and his testimony was steady and specific in the way that credible testimony is. Halston's lawyer fought every piece of it. He was a good lawyer, and Halston had money, and both of those things were real advantages. And there were 2 months when the outcome was genuinely unclear, and Clara felt the uncertainty of it like weather she couldn't do anything about. She woke some mornings already tense, already running the possibilities, and she had to deliberately set it down and focus on the kitchen and the girls and the practical work of the day, because the alternative was to let the waiting swallow everything else. Nathaniel was steadier through this period than she might have expected, which made sense when she thought about it. He had been carrying this fight for 2 years before she arrived, and he had the particular endurance of someone who has learned to operate under sustained uncertainty without letting it become paralysis. He did not minimize what was happening or pretend it was resolved when it wasn't, but he also did not let it stop the ranch from running or the evenings from being what they had become. The four of them at dinner, Lydia's schoolwork, Rose's questions, the lamp in the kitchen. He came to her one evening in March when the hearing had reached a particularly difficult point. Halston's lawyer had challenged the chain of custody on the Purvis document, and he stood in the kitchen doorway and said, without preamble, "I need you to know that whatever happens with this, the ranch is not at risk. I want to be clear about that." Clara looked at him. "I know that. He stopped. "I don't want you to feel that your situation here depends on the outcome. That's not—" He tried again. "You're not contingent on this, Clara. Do you understand what I'm saying?" She understood exactly what he was saying. He was telling her, in the careful language of a man who does not say things easily, that she was not here because of any arrangement that could dissolve, that whatever the lawyers and the magistrates decided, she was not going anywhere. He was telling her this because he needed her to know it, and probably also because he needed to say it, to hear himself say it, to understand it as completely true. "I know," she said again, more gently. "I'm not going anywhere, Nathaniel." He looked at her for a moment with the expression she had first seen in March, that layer beneath the controlled surface where he was less careful about what showed. "Good," he said simply. Then he went to his office, and she went back to her accounts, and the house settled around them with the weight of something that had been said and received and didn't need to be said again. The outcome came in April. Victor Halston was found liable for fraudulent manipulation of county land records in 3 separate instances. The Croft property decision was referred to a territorial appeals process, which meant Jim Croft would not simply get his land back, the law was not that clean, but which opened a legal path that had not existed before. Halston was fined heavily and removed from his position on the county development board, and the 2 county officials who had participated in the scheme were removed from their posts. He was not imprisoned. The law in 1887 Montana Territory was not always equal to the harm done, and Clara was honest enough with herself to feel the frustration of that. A man had tried to have her killed, had driven a family off their land, had manipulated the legal machinery of an entire county for personal gain, and he was going to keep his freedom. But he had lost everything else. His reputation in the territory, which had been the real instrument of his power, was gone. The businesses that had kept their money in his projects quietly withdrew it. The men who had repeated his stories stopped repeating them. He left Harlan Creek by summer and did not come back, and the feed store owner told Gus the following fall that he'd heard Halston had gone to Nevada to start over, which was where people went when they had run out of room everywhere else. Clara thought about this sometimes, about whether it was enough, and about what enough even meant in situations where the harm done could not be fully undone. The Crofts were still 3 counties east on 40 acres. The women who had looked at Clara sideways in Dorothea Marsh's parlor had not all fully reconsidered their opinions. The scar on Clara's understanding of how quickly and completely someone could try to unmake you, that was not gone either. She thought about it, and she let herself be unsatisfied with it, because she believed that was the honest response. The world did not balance its accounts cleanly. You did what you could with what you had, and you tried to stay clear-eyed about the distance between what was and what should have been, and you didn't let that distance make you bitter if you could help it. Not because bitterness was wrong exactly, but because it was expensive, and she had more important things to spend herself on. Spring came to Blackthorn Ranch the way it apparently always came to Montana. Not gradually, but almost suddenly. A hard shift from the long cold into something that felt reckless and new. The land went from brown to a particular saturated green that Clara had no equivalent for from Ohio, and the air smelled different, and the mornings had light in them at 4:30 that made getting up early feel less like discipline and more like the day's natural invitation. The girls bloomed in their own ways. Rose turned 8 in May and had a birthday dinner that she planned herself, with specific requests for every dish, and she sat at the head of the table that Nathaniel quietly yielded to her, and she received her presents with the grave delight of a child who had learned not to take ordinary happiness for granted. Lydia got her spectacles in March, round-lensed, slightly too large for her face, and she wore them with the defiant pride of someone who has decided that needing something is not the same as being weak. She read 3 books the first week she had them, staying up past her bedtime 2 nights running, and when Clara told her gently that her eyes needed rest too, Lydia said, "Just this chapter," in a tone that was so completely normal and adolescent that Clara had to leave the room before she smiled where the girl could see it. Mrs. Holt retired in April. She announced it at breakfast with the practicality she brought to everything. She had a sister in Oregon, she was 62, her knees were giving her trouble in the cold, and she looked at Clara when she said it in a way that was its own kind of handoff. They spent 2 weeks working side by side in a more deliberate way than they ever had, Mrs. Holt pointing out the things that only someone who'd run the house for 7 years would know to point out. Where the cellar leaked in heavy rain, which of the ranch hands had a food allergy he'd never mentioned directly, the particular temperature at which the kitchen stove ran hot, and when to compensate for it. On her last morning, Mrs. Holt stood in the kitchen doorway with her bag and said, "You'll do fine." It was the most direct compliment the woman had ever paid her. Clara recognized it as such and did not make too much of it. "Thank you," she said, "for everything you did here, for the girls especially." Mrs. Holt's expression did something complicated and brief. "They're good girls," she said. "Ellen would be—" She stopped, collected herself. "They're good girls," she said again, and went out to the wagon Tom had ready. Clara stood in the kitchen for a moment after the wagon rolled away, in the particular quiet of a house between one era and the next, and she thought about Ellen Crow, a woman she had never met and never would, who had loved this house and these daughters and this difficult man, and who was somewhere in the grain of all of it still, in the way that people are present in the things they built and the people they loved. She had never tried to replace her. She had tried from the beginning to be something else, something adjacent and distinct, a different kind of woman who meant different things to the people in this house. She thought she had mostly managed it. Not without mistakes. There had been moments with Lydia especially where she'd misread something, moved too fast or held back too long, and had to go back and try again. There had been moments with Nathaniel where the distance between what was said and what was meant had gotten wide enough to be genuinely difficult. There had been mornings when she was tired and frustrated, and the ranch was intractable, and the cold was merciless, and she had thought, briefly and without conviction, about the train east. Those moments were part of it. Anyone who told you that building a life somewhere was just a matter of deciding to was either very lucky or not paying attention. Nathaniel came to her on a Sunday evening in late May. The girls were in bed. The house was the particular kind of quiet that felt inhabited rather than empty. The good kind of quiet, the kind that meant everyone was safe and settled and where they were supposed to be. He came out to the porch where Clara was sitting with a cup of tea that had gone cold, looking at the last of the light over the mountains. He sat down beside her, which he had started doing in recent months, just appearing, not with anything to say necessarily, just sitting in the same space. She had come to understand this as its own form of communication, in the language of a man who found direct expression difficult but showed up consistently, which she had decided was worth more than eloquence. "I've been thinking," he said. She waited. "About what this is?" He looked at the mountains. "About what I'd like it to be." She held her tea. "Tell me." He was quiet for a moment with the weight of someone choosing words carefully, not because he was uncertain of what he meant, but because he wanted to say it right. Because this was the kind of thing where getting it right mattered. "I don't want to run this as an arrangement anymore," he said. "I don't want you here because there's a practical need or because we have letters between us that establish terms. I want you here because you want to be here, and I want you to be here, and that's—" He stopped. "That's a different thing, a bigger thing, and I know I'm not easy. I know I close up when things get hard, and I don't always say the thing I'm thinking when I should say it, and I have a ranch with 2 children and a recent history of someone trying to poison the people He stopped again. "The people in my household." Clara looked at him. "You were going to say something else." He met her eyes. "Yes." She held his gaze for a long moment. Outside, the last of the light was going off the mountains, and the sky was turning the particular violet gray of Montana evenings. And somewhere out in the yard a night bird was making a sound she still didn't know the name of. "Nathaniel," she said, "I came here with a suitcase and a letter and no particular expectations about how any of this would go." And somewhere in the middle of a fence line and a sick child and a poisoned cup and a parlor full of people making up their minds about me. She paused. Somewhere in all of that, this stopped being an arrangement. He waited. I love your daughters, she said. I love this house and this land and the particular way it doesn't care about anything but itself. I love that you notice things from across a room and never say so unless you decide it matters. I love that you sat in a chair all night in your coat because you couldn't make yourself leave. She looked at him directly, the way she had learned to look at him, not waiting for him to look away first. And I love you, which I am telling you plainly because you've told me you're not easy, and I am also not easy, and I think we should at least be honest about what we are to each other before we go any further with it. Nathaniel looked at her for a long time. The controlled surface of him, that careful management he'd been doing for as long as she'd known him, was still there, but something underneath it had come fully to the surface, not cracking through but simply rising, the way water rises when you stop holding it back. Will you stay? He said. Not under terms, not with an arrangement, just, will you stay? Be here, be with us. Yes, she said. That's what I've been saying. Something happened to his face that she had not seen happen before. It wasn't a smile. It was more than that, or different. The expression of a man who has braced against something for so long that when it's finally safe to unbrace, the relief of it is almost overwhelming. He reached over and put his hand over hers on the arm of the chair, and she turned her hand over and held it, and they sat like that in the last of the spring evening, with the mountains going dark and the ranch settling around them into the sounds of night. They married in June. Not grandly. Neither of them wanted grand, and Harlan Creek would not have provided it, even if they had. The ceremony was in the yard at Blackthorn Ranch on a clear morning, with the magistrate presiding because there was no other official they particularly wanted, and the ranch hands in their best clothes, and Dorothea Marsh in the front, who had driven out from town with a gift she presented to Clara with the particular combination of warmth and dignity that was apparently her natural register. Lydia stood beside Clara with her new spectacles and her dark hair braided in the way that had become their morning ritual, and she did not cry, which Clara had not expected, and which turned out not to matter because she held Clara's hand through the entire short ceremony with a grip that said everything that mattered without a single word. Rose cried enough for both of them. Happy crying, the uncomplicated kind, the kind she didn't try to control or explain. She cried and she beamed and she asked the magistrate twice if he was sure they were really married now, until Gus, standing beside her, told her gently that yes, it was quite official, and Rose appeared to accept this. Nathaniel said his vows in a voice that was quiet and certain, the way he said everything he meant, and Clara said hers looking at him and meaning every word with the particular seriousness of a person who does not say things lightly and knows the weight of what she's promising. What she thought about, standing there in the June morning with the mountains at their backs and the ranch all around them, was not the stagecoach or the suitcase or the letter that had started all of it. She thought about what she had been trying to get away from when she'd come west and what she had found instead, and how thoroughly those turned out to be different things. She had come out here running from the shape that her life had collapsed into. She had arrived in a place that had its own shapes, its own difficulties, its own particular hard edges, and she had pushed against those edges until they had given enough to let her in. Not all the way. Belonging is not a destination you reach and stop at. It's a thing you keep building, imperfectly and continuously. But enough. Enough to matter. This is what she had learned, that belonging is not something given. It is not a property of places or families or any arrangement between people. It is something you make over and over in the small daily acts of choosing to stay and work and see and be seen. It is braiding a child's hair in the morning. It is walking a fence line without being asked. It is telling the truth in a room full of people who might not want to hear it. It is sitting in the kitchen at 5:20 with the water on and the bread cut and choosing every single day to be present in the life you are building. No life she has ever heard of was built any other way. That evening, after the guests had gone and the girls were in bed and the ranch had settled into its nighttime self, Clara stood on the porch again, which had become her habit. This porch, this light, this view of the land going infinite in every direction. Nathaniel came and stood beside her. They didn't say anything for a while. There was nothing that needed to be said, which was one of the things she had come to love most about him. The knowledge that silence between them was not absence, but presence, that you didn't have to fill every space with words to be fully there. "What are you thinking about?" he said eventually. She thought about it honestly. "Ohio," she said, "and how far away it is." He looked at her. "Do you miss it?" "Sometimes, the way you miss things that shaped you, even if you wouldn't go back." She looked at the mountains, black against the dark blue sky. "I miss my father. I miss who I was before things got hard." She paused. "But I wouldn't trade it. Any of it. Not even the hard parts." He was quiet for a moment. "Not even the poisoning?" "I'd trade the poisoning," she said. "I'll give you that one." He made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was the closest thing to one she had heard from him, and she turned and looked at him in the porch light, this man who was not easy and had never pretended to be, who kept his feelings behind a door and opened it only when he was sure, and who had sat all night in a hospital chair in his coat because some part of him had already decided, even then, that he was not going to be able to let her go. She thought about what it meant to be seen by a person like that. Not the easy version of you, not the version you put forward in polite company, but the actual version. The one who was afraid and showed up anyway, who made mistakes and came back around and tried again. To be known by a person like that, fully and without pretense, and to be wanted anyway. She had not come west looking for that. She had been too practical and too worn down for that kind of looking. But she had found it, in the particular roundabout way that things find you when you stop trying to manage every outcome and start doing the honest work in front of you. She reached over and took his hand. He let her, without ceremony, the way he let her everything now. Not as a concession, but as a choice, made clearly and kept. Inside the house, the lamp was burning in the kitchen. Not because Mrs. Holt had lit it, not because anyone had assigned it as a task. Because it was what you did at Blackthorn Ranch now. You left the lamp on, so that anyone coming home could see the light from the road. Clara had started it, and now it was just how things were done. The woman who had arrived on a dusty stagecoach with a suitcase and a worn photograph and a letter had become, by the gradual accumulation of 10,000 ordinary days, the kind of person a house arranges itself around. Not because she had been perfect. She had not. Not because the world had been fair. It had not. But because she had been present and persistent and honest, and because she had understood something that took most people a lifetime to learn, that home is not the place you come from. It is the place you build, one hard day at a time, with the people willing to build it with you. That is the whole of it. The rest is just the living.
How's it going? Hope you're doing well. Rainy. Okay, it's rainy. Okay, thank you. Thank you. I don't know them. Let me see. I feel like I know this name though. I thought he might have had a Seattle, not a Seattle. Oh, I see. I see. I see. No, I don't know them. Never mind. I'm wondering